The chaos that followed the initial takedown of Thomas Crane only grew in the weeks that came after. And by the time the investigation into the HOA's corruption reached its boiling point, the entire community had transformed into a battlefield of whispers, lawsuits, and shattered reputations. Because while the neighbors thought they had already witnessed the end when Crane was humiliated on his driveway, that spectacle was only the spark. The match thrown into the kindling of years of hidden abuse, and as Ellis pressed forward with his investigation, every resident began to feel the tremors, subpoenas arriving in the mail, federal agents knocking on doors, reporters flooding the sidewalks with cameras pointed at houses that had once seemed so serene, until the very concept of privacy disintegrated. And yet through it all, Crane remained in the center. Not as the ruler he once was, but as the exposed core of the scandal, dragged repeatedly into the harsh glare of television broadcasts, mugshots, plastered across the internet after his eventual arrest for embezzlement and fraud. His arrogance collapsing into a gaunt, stormed a furious shell of a man who shouted at journalists that this was all a vendetta, a witch hunt against him. Words that might have swayed the fearful once, but now only made him appear smaller, weaker, and while his world imploded in slow motion, Ellis never once flinched, because for him this was never just about legal battles. It was about ensuring his son and every other child in that community would never again suffer under the fist of a tyrant. Masquerading as a community leader, and so he kept his foot on the gas, ordering further probes into the HOA's finances.
Of discovering layers of rot so deep it shocked even seasoned agents, shell companies siphoning funds,
kickbacks disguised as landscape maintenance, and political donations laundered through association accounts. And as each revelation surfaced, the residents who had once cowered in silence now stood taller, many of them banding together in class action suits, their once fractured voices uniting into a chorus demanding restitution. And the board members who had enabled Crane scrambled for deals, some turning on him to save themselves, others resigning in disgrace until what had once been an untouchable HOA empire lay in ruins, its bylaws shredded in court, its accounts frozen, its credibility obliterated. And through it all, Ellis kept his promise to his son. Not only would Crane pay for what he did, but the entire rotten system that allowed him to thrive would be dismantled so thoroughly that it could never rise again. And by the time the final court date arrived, with Crane dragged in shackles before a judge, the courtroom packed with residents who had come to witness the conclusion, Ellis sat calmly in the front row beside Darius, his hand resting firmly on his son's shoulder, a silent reassurance that justice was not just an abstract word but a living force. And when the gavel fell, sentencing Crane to years in federal prison, the sound echoed far beyond the courthouse, rippling through the community like a cleansing storm, because in that moment, every resident understood that the age of fear was over. That no one, not even the self-proclaimed king of their cul-de-sac, was above the law, and the HOA president, who once ruled with an iron grip, would now spend his days behind bars, remembered not as a leader, but as a cautionary tale of arrogance destroyed by justice. And for Ellis, for Darius, and for every neighbor who had ever felt small under Crane's thumb, it was more than victory. It was the end of an era. The final chapter in a story that had begun with a scream on a quiet suburban street and ended with a reckoning so complete that no one who lived through it would ever forget. The downfall of Thomas Crane might have seemed complete that day when the FBI director himself stood on his driveway with cameras flashing and neighbors staring. But in truth, that moment was only the prologue to something much larger. Because, while Crane's personal authority shattered instantly under the weight of federal power, the HOA machine he had built over years of intimidation did not collapse overnight. It lingered like a wounded beast, snarling and dangerous. Because Crane's loyalists on the board, frightened yet desperate, scrambled to salvage their positions. Whispering in back rooms about electing a new president, about spinning the narrative that Crane was a rogue leader, trying to shield themselves from the tidal wave of scrutiny that now swept through the community. And as reporters camped outside the gates and residents whispered freely for the first time in years, Ellis's team pushed deeper, peeling. Back the layers of HOA corruption that had festered for too long, covering missing funds, fraudulent maintenance contracts, and even records that suggested ties to local politicians who had benefited from the HOA's bloated treasury. And though Ellis could have walked away after publicly destroying the man who hurt his son, something inside him burned hotter. A sense that Crane had not acted alone but had thrived in a system of greed and exploitation that preyed on ordinary families, so he stayed involved. Personally overseeing the investigation, his agents embedded in the neighborhood, gathering evidence, while Crane himself sat in his locked house like a caged animal, stripped of power but still too arrogant to admit defeat, ranting to anyone who would answer his calls that this was all a conspiracy, that he would sue the FBI and take everyone down with him. His words increasingly unhinged as his world shrank to nothing. And though neighbors walked past his home with newfound boldness, some even smirking at his drawn blinds, none of them realized that Crane's desperation was about to turn dangerous. Because humiliation breeds recklessness, and as Ellis focused on dismantling the wider network of corruption, Crane was plotting in the shadows, scribbling names in notebooks, making late-night calls to old allies, clutching at any thread that might restore the control he had lost. Unaware that every move he made was already being watched, recorded, and cataloged. Because once the FBI had its eye on you, there was no such thing as privacy. Only the slow tightening of the net until escape was impossible, and while Darius returned to school carrying both bruises on his knees, and a strange new celebrity. Among classmates who whispered that his dad had destroyed the HOA president, his father carried the heavier burden of knowing that this was only the beginning. Beneath the manicured surface of the neighborhood lay a rot far deeper than even he had anticipated. A rot that once exposed would shake not just the residents but the very town that had allowed such tyranny to flourish unchecked. The following day, the neighborhood experienced an eerie shift. A silence so heavy it seemed to press down on the manicured lawns and perfectly aligned mailboxes. Because while Crane continued strutting about, clipboard in hand, jotting down supposed violations and barking at the maintenance crew, the residents were no longer merely irritated. They were watching him differently. Some emboldened by the anonymous note, others unsettled by the sight of unfamiliar cars with tinted windows idling quietly at the corners. And while Crane dismissed it all as paranoia, the truth was that the walls were tightening. Because Raymond Ellis's operation had begun in earnest. His agents methodically interviewing former residents who had fled the neighborhood years before, families with stories of harassment, forged fines, threats of foreclosure, even one elderly widow who described Crane pounding on her door late at night demanding payment. Her trembling testimony recorded and filed away as another nail in the coffin of his reputation, and though Crane had always believed his power absolute within the gates, he didn't realize that the very bylaws he weaponized were riddled with loopholes and inconsistencies that a skilled legal team could shred to pieces. And Ellis had assembled the best attorneys who specialized in exposing corruption, who began quietly filing motions and preparing suits that would entangle Crane in so many legal snares he wouldn't be able to breathe. But Ellis wasn't satisfied with mere paperwork. He wanted Crane to feel his empire crumble in front of the neighbors he had ruled over like a tyrant. So when agents in plain clothes approached sympathetic residents and encouraged them to come forward, a tide began to rise, whispers turning into open complaints. And one by one, the residents who had once bowed to Crane's authority began secretly meeting in garages and living rooms, planning to testify, to share their stories, to finally drag his abuses into the light. Yet even as the walls closed in, Crane clung to arrogance, telling himself that no one would dare cross him, that he had the board in his pocket, that residents were too afraid to act. But that illusion began to fracture when he arrived at the clubhouse for the weekly meeting and found the usually obedient board members exchanging uneasy glances, their eyes darting away from his, their voices quieter, and though they nodded at his commands, he sensed hesitation, cracks in loyalty that made his jaw tighten. And when one of them stammered, "Maybe we should ease up on some of the fines." "Tom," he exploded, slamming his fist on the table, spittle flying as he roared about discipline and respect, his outburst echoing through the empty hallways until even his closest allies sat stiff and silent, realizing, perhaps for the first time, that their leader wasn't just strict, he was unstable, dangerous, and as that thought rooted itself, in their minds, the balance of power began to shift without him noticing. Because power is fragile, held together by fear and illusion, and once people stop believing, it collapses quickly. And collapse was already underway, fueled by the quiet but relentless hand of the FBI director who watched from afar, waiting for the perfect moment to strike so publicly that Crane's downfall would serve as both justice and warning. And as night by the third day after the incident, the neighborhood was no longer the quiet, polished enclave it had once been, because beneath the trimmed hedges and neat driveways there was a crackling tension that no one could ignore, a sense that something enormous was about to happen. And while children played more quietly and parents lingered at windows longer, the man at the center of it all was unraveling faster than he realized, because Thomas Crane woke that morning to find another note slid under his door, this one sharper, colder, reading, "We know about the money. We know about the threats. Your time is almost up." And though he cursed, pacing his kitchen and barking at his wife that it was all nonsense, his mind raced with fear, because he had taken money, he had made threats, and the possibility that someone truly knew about. It hollowed his stomach, yet instead of pausing, instead of stepping back, his pride drove him further into madness, storming out of his house with renewed aggression, confronting residents on sidewalks, demanding compliance with rules that seemed increasingly absurd, fining a family for leaving a bicycle in the driveway overnight, screaming at a teenager for having music too loud in his car. Each confrontation captured quietly on cell phones by neighbors who no longer feared him, but collected evidence footage. That began to spread online until whispers of the HOA tyrant reached beyond their gates, sparking local reporters to sniff around, and while Crane fumed, convinced it was only gossip. Ellis and his team smiled grimly, because the trap was closing exactly as planned. The weight of legal filings, testimonies, and media scrutiny building into a wave that would crash down all at once. And when Ellis finally chose to step into the neighborhood personally, arriving in a black SUV flanked by 2 agents, his presence was like thunder rolling across the cul-de-sac. Residents stepping out onto porches, whispering as they recognized the man from television. The director of the FBI himself, walking calmly, deliberately, toward Crane's house, his polished shoes crunching against the driveway gravel as Crane, red-faced and sweating, stormed outside demanding, "What the hell do you think you're doing here?" But Ellis didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. He simply looked the man in the eye and said with a calm that chilled everyone listening, "You laid hands on my son. Now you're going to answer for everything you've done." And the silence that followed was electric. Neighbors holding their breath as agents stepped forward, presenting papers, legal documents, evidence, while cameras from a suddenly gathered press crew clicked in word, and for the first time in years, Crane's booming voice faltered, his bluster collapsing under the weight of exposure. His protests drowned out by the undeniable truth that his reign was finished, because in that moment the illusion shattered completely. Not only was he powerless against the man standing before him, but every neighbor he had bullied was now watching, no longer afraid, no longer silent, and as his wife stood frozen in the doorway, the reality crashing down on them, Crane understood far too late that a single act of cruelty against a child had unleashed a force he could never have imagined, a force that didn't just strip him of his title but of his very sense of dominance. And as Ellis turned away, his arm gently resting on Darius's shoulder, where the boy had come to watch, the residents erupted in a murmur that was half relief, half awe, because the message was clear and unforgettable. Thomas Crane had picked a fight not with a boy, not with a family, but with the director of the FBI, and in doing so, he had destroyed himself. And though Section 1 of this story closes here, with the image of Crane's empire collapsing in the daylight, it was only the beginning of the larger storm that would drag the entire HOA into the harsh light of truth, exposing corruption, deeper and darker than anyone in that neighborhood had ever imagined. Fell again, the Ellis household sat calm, Darius smiling for the first time in days as his father tucked him in, unaware of the storm of agents, lawyers, and residents moving like chess pieces around their enemy. Because to Darius it was simple, his father had promised to protect him. And that promise meant safety, but to Crane, sleepless in his locked house, staring out the window at shadows that seemed to linger too long. The promise meant something else entirely. The tightening of a noose woven from every abuse, every lie, every smug laugh he had ever delivered at the expense of others. And though he still clung to denial, deep down he felt it the beginning of the end. The following day, the neighborhood experienced an eerie shift, silence so heavy it seemed to press down on the manicured lawns and perfectly aligned mailboxes. Because while Crane continued strutting about, clipboard in hand, jotting down supposed violations and barking at the maintenance crew, the residents were no longer merely irritated, they were watching him differently. Some emboldened by the anonymous note, others unsettled by the sight of unfamiliar cars with tinted windows idling quietly at the corners. And while Crane dismissed it all as paranoia, the truth was that the walls were tightening, because Raymond Ellis's operation had begun in earnest. His agents methodically interviewing former residents who had fled the neighborhood years before. Families with stories of harassment, forged fines, threats of foreclosure. Even one elderly widow who described Crane pounding on her door late at night demanding payment. Her trembling testimony recorded and filed away as another nail in the coffin of his reputation. And though Crane had always believed his power absolute within the gates, he didn't realize that the very bylaws he weaponized were riddled with loopholes and inconsistencies that a skilled legal team could shred to pieces. And Ellis had assembled the best attorneys who specialized in exposing corruption, who began quietly filing motions and preparing suits that would entangle Crane in so many legal snares he wouldn't be able to breathe. But Ellis wasn't satisfied with mere paperwork. He wanted Crane to feel his empire crumble in front of the neighbors he had ruled over like a tyrant. So when agents in plain clothes approached sympathetic residents and encouraged them to come forward, a tide began to rise, whispers turning into open complaints. And one by one, the residents who had once bowed to Crane's authority began secretly meeting in garages and living rooms, planning to testify, to share their stories, to finally drag his abuses into the light. Yet even as the walls closed in, Crane clung to arrogance, telling himself that no one would dare cross him, that he had the board in his pocket, that residents were too afraid to act. But that illusion began to fracture when he arrived at the clubhouse for the weekly meeting and found the usually obedient board members exchanging uneasy glances, their eyes darting away from his, their voices quieter, and though they nodded at his commands, he sensed hesitation, cracks in loyalty that made his jaw tighten. And when one of them stammered, "Maybe we should ease up on some of the fines." "Tom," he exploded, slamming his fist on the table, spittle flying as he roared about discipline and respect, his outburst echoing through the empty hallways until even his closest allies sat stiff and silent, realizing perhaps for the first time that their leader wasn't just strict, he was unstable, dangerous. And as that thought rooted itself in their minds, the balance of power began to shift without him noticing. Because power is fragile, held together by fear and illusion, and once people stop believing, it collapses quickly. And collapse was already underway, fueled by the quiet but relentless hand of the FBI director who watched from afar, waiting for the perfect moment to strike so publicly that Crane's downfall would serve as both justice and warning. As night fell again, the Ellis household sat calm. Darius, smiling for the first time in days as his father tucked him in, unaware of the storm of agents, lawyers, and residents moving like chess pieces around their enemy. Because to Darius, it was simple. His father had promised to protect him. And that promise meant safety, but to Crane, sleepless in his locked house, staring out the window at shadows that seemed to linger too long, the promise meant something else entirely. The tightening of a noose woven from every abuse, every lie, every smug laugh he had ever delivered at the expense of others. And though he still clung to denial, deep down, he felt at the beginning of the end. By morning, the neighborhood woke to whispers that spread like smoke through the cul-de-sac. Because while most of the residents hadn't seen the altercation themselves, word traveled fast. Mothers at the bus stop leaned close and murmured about the boy Crane grabbed, retirees watering their lawns, muttered that Crane was losing it. And even the teenagers scrolling on their phones passed along. Shaky video clips captured by two brave residents who had filmed the incident from behind their curtains. Those grainy recordings already trickling onto local message boards where outrage built like a brush fire, though Crane strutted about with his usual arrogance. Convinced that intimidation worked just as it always had, his phone buzzing with messages of support from his loyal board members, repeated back his narrative that the boy was disrespectful and that Crane was keeping order. And as he reviewed HOA violation reports at his breakfast table, he laughed about finding the Ellis family, scribbling a note to send official letter about unsupervised minors on community property, oblivious that the man he intended to intimidate was already orchestrating his ruin from an office filled with men and women trained to dismantle cartels, track fugitives, and expose corruption. And while Crane sent off emails with smug satisfaction, Raymond Ellis convened a private meeting at the Bureau, laying out Crane's file with the same intensity he might reserve for a mob boss, his senior. Agents leaning in as he detailed misappropriation of HOA funds, illicit kickbacks from contractors, even whispers of threats made against residents who resisted his rule. And though an outsider might wonder why the director of the FBI would dedicate resources to something as small as a suburban HOA, anyone in that room understood this wasn't just about a bully president. It was about a father whose child had been hurt, and in that context, nothing was small, nothing was unworthy. And the agents listened, grim-faced, because they too knew that when their boss gave an order tied to his family, it was more than professional, it was personal, and personal meant unstoppable. So as Ellis gave instructions, surveillance, financial tracing, interviews with past residents, his team moved with the precision of a machine, spreading into the quiet suburb disguised as ordinary passersby, delivery drivers, and utility workers, gathering evidence with invisible hands, while inside the neighborhood residents began noticing unfamiliar cars parked on corners, strangers walking dogs that no one had seen before. But because the community was so used to the paranoia of Crane's constant rule, few questioned it, and Crane himself, blinded by ego, assumed the attention he drew was admiration, not investigation, laughing at his own jokes as he barked orders at landscapers and belittled anyone who crossed his path, even as the walls of his world began closing in. For Ellis had no intention of letting this battle play out quietly. He wanted Crane to feel cornered, to sense the shadows gathering before the hammer fell. And that evening, as Crane returned home to his pristine white-columned house, he found an envelope taped to his doorknob, the usual HOA paperwork he sent but one, marked with his own name in bold black ink, and though he scoffed, ripping it open, his smirk faltered when he read the words typed inside. "You hurt the wrong child. We're watching you now." His eyes darted around the street, searching for whoever had dared leave it, but the lawns were empty, the houses still. And for the first time in years, Thomas Crane felt something foreign slip into his chest, fear, a crawling unease that no fine or threat could shake. And though he told his wife it was just some punk kid playing games, he found himself locking the doors twice that night, drawing the blinds tighter, sipping whiskey with a hand that trembled ever so slightly, because somewhere deep inside, he knew he had stirred something far greater than an angry parent, though he still couldn't imagine the scale of destruction about to descend on him. Destruction carefully designed by a man who understood patience, precision, and the art of taking an enemy apart piece by piece until nothing remained but the memory of their arrogance and the ruins of their power. The neighborhood's air split with the sound of a child's scream, sharp and panicked, as the HOA president's hand gripped the boy's arm far too tight, dragging him across the manicured lawn while neighbors watched in frozen silence, none of them realizing that the terrified little boy was the son of the FBI director himself, and that what happened next would shatter their entire community. Because in that moment, as the HOA president Thomas Crane yanked the boy named Darius, a 10-year-old who had been quietly riding his small blue bike along the cul-de-sac, his aggression wasn't just about a child on a sidewalk. It was about control, about power, about a man who thought he owned the neighborhood and everyone in it. And though the crowd of residents stared with their mouths open, not one person dared step forward, because for years Crane had bullied, fined, threatened, and dictated every minor detail of their lives. from the color of their shutters to the number of flower pots allowed on a porch. But now his cruelty crossed a line so unthinkable that it made even his staunchest supporters pale with unease. Because Darius wasn't just anybody's child, he was the son of Raymond Ellis, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a man whose reach extended into every corner of law enforcement in the country, a man whose silence could end careers and whose voice could summon entire task forces overnight. But in this suburban enclave tucked behind gates and lined with perfect hedges, none of the residents knew who the boy's father really was, and that ignorance led to a chain of events so explosive, so devastating that their pristine neighborhood would never recover. For as Crane barked, "Get this filthy bike off HOA property," and shoved Darius so hard that he stumbled, skinning his knees on the concrete, the boy's eyes brimmed with tears, not only from pain but from fury. Because though he was young, Darius had been taught resilience by his father, had been told countless times that when faced with bullies, you don't cower. You remember who you are. And though he trembled, he whispered words that made Crane laugh, then choke on his arrogance. "My dad's going to make you pay for this." A childish threat in Crane's ears, but a prophecy in truth. Because within hours, that whisper would become the thunder that ripped apart the foundation of Crane's kingdom. But in that moment, he sneered and spat back. "Your dad? What's he going to do? Mow my lawn wrong? Get out of here before I find your whole family?" And he shoved Darius's bike so hard it clattered against the curb, paint scraping, a wheel bent, while Darius, his small hand scraped raw, ran toward home, his heart pounding, his mind already rehearsing how he'd tell his father without sounding weak, without sounding like a child tattling. Because though Darius was only 10, his life had never been ordinary. His father's job meant he lived with constant reminders of threats, security, and strength. And though his father had promised him a safe life inside this gated community, today proved that monsters didn't always look like criminals in shadows. They sometimes wore golf polos and carried HOA clipboards. And as the boy ran, neighbors whispered among themselves, torn between fear of Crane and outrage at his treatment of a child. A few even daring to pull out phones and capture shaky videos of the altercation, clips that within days would leak online and go viral. But at that moment, the real storm was still far off, because Darius's father, Raymond Ellis, was sitting in his Washington office when he got the call from his son's trembling voice. And though Raymond had heard countless reports of violence, corruption, and cruelty in his long career, nothing compared to the chill that spread through his veins when his son choked out, "Dad, the HOA man hurt me." And as Raymond listened, his jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, and the silence in his office grew heavy. Because in that instant, the full weight of federal authority shifted from distant matters of national security to something deeply personal. And Raymond knew without hesitation that Crane had just ignited a war he could not possibly win. For when a man lays hands on the child of the FBI director, there are consequences beyond fines, beyond neighborhood rules, beyond anything the smug president of a suburban HOA could comprehend. And as Raymond quietly told his son, "Don't worry, I'll take care of this," his staff noticed the change in him, the shift from calm strategist to wrathful father. And though none of them knew yet what had happened, they understood instinctively that someone's life had just veered into catastrophe. Because Raymond Ellis wasn't just powerful, he was meticulous. And when he moved against an enemy, he didn't merely punish, he dismantled. He made sure they were stripped of dignity, allies, and future. And as he left his office that afternoon, phone pressed to his ear as he called his most trusted agents. His words were few but lethal. "Gather everything on a man named Thomas Crane. Tonight." From there, the story of this community unraveled like a thread pulled from a tightly woven sweater. Because while the HOA had long believed itself untouchable, its bylaws ironclad, and its president unassailable, the truth was that it had built its fortress on arrogance. And now that fortress was about to face the unrelenting siege of federal justice. And as Darius wiped his tears at home, his mother tending to his cuts, the boy found a flicker of comfort in her calm smile. Because she knew her husband well, knew that Crane's days of terrorizing families were numbered, and that soon the entire neighborhood would learn a lesson they'd never forget. that when you raise your hand against the wrong child, invite the fury of forces far greater than any HOA fine, and the reckoning was only beginning.